entering the room. So we will get started. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are, and happy Friday. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Tina Barr, and I'm the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, or NACOLE. NACOLE is an organization that works to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities seeking to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. One part of that effort is our webinar series. Since 2015, NACOLE has worked to bring you information on effective practices in civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and efforts to reform the criminal legal system through the webinar series. Before we get started with the webinar today, I'd like to go over a few logistics. First, you have the ability to turn on your closed captions for this webinar by using the caption button at the bottom of your screen. Next, please be aware that the chat feature is disabled. However, the Q&A feature is on, so you can type your questions there at any point in time. To make sure that our speaker today covers all the information they've prepared, they'll respond to questions towards the end of the presentation. Everyone will have the ability to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up icon beside each particular question. And upvoting just moves questions up in the queue, so that will help us to address some of the most pressing questions during the time that we have in the first hour. Now, to allow more time for questions and direct engagement between the speaker and audience members today, immediately after the webinar, we'll have a 30-minute discussion. Now, that will take place in a separate Zoom room. And so within the last 10 minutes of this webinar, I will provide the Zoom link for that in the chat that can go directly out to you all. So I will ensure that everyone who wants to join that room has that link. It is not a requirement. It is completely optional and up to you whether you join that. Finally, please know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to everyone who has registered for the webinar for 3 months. And so everyone will receive an email within 5 days of today with information on how to access the recording, as well as a link to the PDF version of the slides that our speaker will use today. Okay, having gone through all of that, I want to turn to the webinar for the day. Understanding Civilian Oversight's Fast-Changing Legal Landscape. For the sake of time, just know that I'm going to give an abbreviated description of the webinar as well as a shortened version of the speaker's bio. Please know that the full description and the full bio are available on the webinar page of the NACOLE website. Okay. Our speaker today, Sharon Fairley, will discuss recent developments in state law as well as case law from jurisdictions around the country that impact how civilian oversight entities may be established and how they are permitted to operate. Since 2020, there have been substantial developments in the legal framework within which civilian oversight operates, some hospitable to oversight, others hostile. As a result, in the past few years, civilian oversight entities have increasingly engaged in litigation regarding the legality of their establishment and the scope of their powers. Our speaker today is Sharon Fairley, professor from practice at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Fairley is a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School and has taught there since 2015. Prior to that, Professor Fairley spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and also served as the first Deputy Inspector General and General Counsel for the City of Chicago Office of the Inspector General. In December 2015, following the controversial officer-involved shooting death of Laquan McDonald, Professor Fairley was appointed to serve as the Chief Administrator of the Independent Police Review Authority. She was also responsible for creating and building Chicago's Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA. Professor Fairley's areas of academic inquiry focus on criminal justice reform with an emphasis on constitutional policing and police accountability. Professor Fairley graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University with a BS degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering, and also holds an MBA in marketing from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She's a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. And so without further ado, I will turn things over to Professor Fairley, and I will go off screen, but I'll be around if you need me.
Well, thank you so much, Tina, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And welcome and thank you for joining me, everyone that's here today. I'm going to try to go ahead and get my slides going here. Just give me 1 second. All right. So hopefully everybody is seeing the title slide. Okay, terrific, great. All right, well, so the presentation that I'm going to share with you this afternoon is based on research that was conducted last year and last summer. And so, it may not be completely up to date. I've tried to add things that I've noticed recently, but my teaching responsibilities during the calendar year don't let me have a lot of time to continue the research. So I hope to continue updating this research. I'm sharing with you information on state legislation. The source of that is the National Coalition of State Legislators database. And then also with regard to the local case information, our research assistants conducted research on Westlaw. And so both of those sources, may not be perfect in terms of covering everything. So that's my long way of saying, if you are aware of statutes or other cases, litigation that you have been involved in that I haven't reflected here today that would be interesting for other people to learn about, I would certainly appreciate it if you share that with me. That would be terrific. But just to start off with, I think it would be helpful to just ground us in where civilian oversight is going and has been going for the last few years. And this is a chart, this is a database that I've collected over the years, which is the prevalence of civilian oversight in the most populous US cities. And as you can see, the creation of civilian oversight over time was pretty steady until around the time period of 2015 to 2019, which was when we had a number of very highly public incidents that were happening on a national basis. And then we saw this big uptick in the creation of civilian oversight across the country. And then, of course, that trend continued and after 2020 with the killing of George Floyd. And so civilian oversight at this point is in over half of the largest countries in the cities in the United States. So a little bit over 50% of the top 200 cities in the United States have some form of civilian oversight. But again, as we know, civilian oversight continues to be most prevalent in the larger cities. So it's almost ubiquitous in the top 50 largest cities, at over 92% of those cities having some form of oversight. And so that's that trend we see continuing. But then we're also seeing a lot of smaller cities creating civilian oversight, particularly in the wake of George Floyd. When we think about the form or functions of civilian oversight, the review model, meaning an entity that reviews internal investigations conducted by the police department itself, continues to be the most prevalent form of civilian oversight, but followed closely by the investigative model. And then the advisory model is where you have a board that provides advice only. The supervisory model is what I call I call the supervisory. It's really the police commissions. The appeals function is where you have an entity that's really just responsible for hearing appeals of disciplinary matters. The adjudicative function is those entities like the Chicago Police Board that actually adjudicate disciplinary matters. And then the audit function is really where the inspectors general reside. So we can see the prevalence of those types among the 200 cities. The other interesting thing to note is, some civilian oversight takes the form of a board, meaning a group of individuals that come together to do certain kinds of things, versus an agency, which is kind of a city entity that's comprised of professional investigators and individuals responsible for conducting the work. And so we continue to see most cities having a board as the form of their civilian oversight, with about a third having agencies. In terms of the entities that exist, it's about 2/3 boards and 1/3 agencies at this point. Okay, so now let's get into the legal stuff. So I think, it's important to understand that, obviously there are several sources of law that govern that govern civilian oversight in terms of its structure, its powers, and how it operates. So, we start with the U.S. Constitution. Like any other government entity, civilian oversight entities are bound to uphold the U.S. Constitution, and federal constitutional law does set some boundaries regarding how civilian oversight entities conduct the work that they do, and also forms the basis for a lot of decisions that are made. For example, the Fourth Amendment law governs how entities view when they evaluate use of force cases. So constitutional principles are at play. We also have state constitutions that can impact the scope and functions of civilian oversight in a myriad of ways. For example, most state constitutions establish sheriffs as a constitutional office, and that often makes civilian oversight in that context a lot more complicated. One current example of how state constitutions can impact civilian oversight is reflected in a current controversy that's happening right in Chicago. There's an ongoing litigation actually, between the city of Chicago and the police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, around the adjudication of serious police misconduct matters. So for over 60 years, the Chicago Police Board have been responsible for adjudicating these serious misconduct matters. So any matter where the department was seeking a sanction of a year of suspension up to and including separation. But what happened was the state of Illinois enacted a constitutional amendment that had to do with collective bargaining rights. And so that solidified some collective bargaining rights. And so the union sort of latched onto that to challenge the jurisdiction of the Chicago Police Board, arguing that the officers should have the right to arbitrate those matters instead of taking them to the police board. And so that litigation is ongoing. The issue around arbitration has already been decided. The officers are going to have the right to choose to have arbitration instead of adjudication by the police board. And now the litigation is all around how transparent that arbitration should be. And I'm sure we all know state statutes also have a profound impact on the power and operations of civilian oversight entities. And many states have law enforcement officer Bill of Rights statutes, for example, that govern the disciplinary process. And of course, as we know recently, there are a lot of state statutes that have been coming online that are really focused directly on the issue of civilian oversight. And I'll talk through about some of those in a moment. So in the state statutes, when we look, there are state statutes that are around civilian oversight specifically. There are the law enforcement officer Bill of Rights provisions. There are state law around access to disciplinary records. There's state law around law enforcement and administration. There's the substantive criminal law. And then also there's state law that establishes law enforcement powers. And so all this is a source of law that can impact how civilian oversight operates. Focusing specifically on the state legislation that's happened, relatively recently, say in the last 4 years or so, there have been a number of states that have enacted a legislation, but there's also been some measures that have been tried and failed as well. Here's a list of states where we found activity that was really directly relevant to civilian oversight. And so looking at this activity, it has left us with a landscape. And if you look across the country, where we have pockets and states that are hospitable to civilian oversight, and those are reflected in the green. And then we also have states that are not very kind of hostile to civilian oversight, where it's very limited. And so we sort of see that sort of starting to develop and play out across the country. When you look at the scope here, California seems to be the most hospitable to civilian oversight. They created the possibility to have oversight for their sheriffs recently. They have also established civilian oversight for state agencies, such as the BART system in San Francisco for their police department. And they've also done a number of things like, making access to disciplinary records more easier. So California is kind of out in front. Connecticut, Kansas, Missouri, Nevada, Oregon, and Virginia also have state statutes that explicitly authorize the establishment of civilian oversight boards. And so they can be favorable areas as well. States that are less favorable, we know Arizona passed a statute that is, really limited the scope of civilian oversight, which I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, Florida as well, and last year enacted a statute that really kind of disbanded the existing civilian oversight and very much limited the kind of oversight that could be rebuilt in its wake. And so we have this sort of patchwork of states across the country that sort of reflect, how hospitable the states are to civilian oversight. But getting into some of the specific state measures that have come online in the last few years, I'm going to start first with those that have been sort of favorable to civilian oversight. In Connecticut, in 2020, they enacted pretty much, it was an omnibus police reform bill, but it did include a provision that allows legislative bodies and towns in the state to create by ordinance civilian police review boards and giving them the power to issue subpoenas and to require the production of materials from the law enforcement entity. So it's a pretty powerful statute. Virginia also passed a statute in 2020 that authorized really broad powers for civilian oversight. In their statute, civilian oversight entities can be created to receive and investigate complaints and issue findings around complaints and around incidents. Civilian oversight entities under this authority can also make binding disciplinary determinations. They can investigate policies and practices. They can review investigations conducted by the law enforcement agencies. And it also provides that they can make public reporting, which is also really important. So transparency as well. So that was one of the really favorable statutes that came online. As I mentioned, California passed a statute that allows counties to establish civilian oversight for sheriff's departments. And so we've seen a lot of activity in the state standing up, working towards standing up entities for local sheriffs. Oops, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Oh, and then let's see, Connecticut. Connecticut also passed a statute that upholds the enforcement of civilian oversight issued subpoenas, allowing agencies to issue subpoenas and have them being upheld. Maryland, for those of you who haven't heard about it, also passed a statute that requires the establishment of civilian oversight for each county. Which when it was passed, it was very innovative, and it sounded really exciting and promising. But there have been some fits and starts about its execution. And so 3 years after this act came online, there are counties that are still struggling to stand these agencies up and figure out exactly what it is that they should be doing. So there is still some, it's not perfect, but there's still some work being done there to figure out how to implement that particular statute. Oregon also passed a statute that sort of allowed civilian oversight entities that were pre-existing to continuing operating as they are. And it allows a form of oversight, but it requires that it be established via a certain process that requires, for example, a referendum by the city. So it does allow it, but it creates some constraints around how civilian oversight can be created. And then also California passed a statute that requires agencies to report to the Post when oversight entities make findings that could result in suspension or decertification, which I think was a positive development in California. Now turning to the less favorable information that's come online, Iowa passed a statute that gives officers the right to legal representation at proceedings related to a complaint and prohibits an officer's lawyer or union rep from being compelled to disclose information from that officer. So again, here we're seeing a statute that really focuses on, cabining the disciplinary process that can undermine sometimes the ability of civilian oversight to conduct investigations in a positive and productive way. Missouri passed a statute that also enhanced procedural mechanisms for disciplinary investigations that in some ways could put up roadblocks for civilian oversight. Then we have the situation in Arizona. Arizona passed this statute that really limited the scope and powers of civilian oversight. And when the statute passed, there were at least 3 civilian oversight entities that were impacted. Of course, the biggest and most established was in Phoenix, which is the Office of Accountability and Transparency. But there was also Tucson has the independent police auditor, and Chandler, Arizona had a citizens panel for review of police complaints and use of force. So all of those entities were impacted. When we look at the Phoenix situation, I think, they've done I think they've done as well as they could in redesigning the organization to do the best work that they can within the constraints that were created by this statute. Initially, the ordinance that created the Phoenix oversight entity, they were meant to be an investigative body, but of course that the statute no longer allows independent investigations. Civilian oversight entities can merely review investigations. And so the new entity has been redesigned to sort of do what they call monitoring the process of these internal investigations. And so they've redesigned their organization to try to deliver on the original mission as best they could. They also added in Phoenix a civilian review board into 2024, which is empowered to review and discuss this monitoring work that the agency does, and provide policy recommendations. And so I think it'll be interesting to see and really understand and learn from them. If there's anybody on the call from there, I'd love to hear how that's going. And how well you're able to sort of achieve the original mission in light of the statutory constraints. Tennessee similarly passed a very restrictive statute that disbanded the existing civilian oversight entities and limited the scope of new entities that were to be created. And of course, the biggest impact was on the agency in Nashville, run by our very favorite Jill Bichard. And so I know that they've also had to scramble and turn around and redesign their organization and created a new entity in response to the statute to figure out how to deliver on oversight to the best they can within the constraints that they have based on the statute. So the way that they decided to sort of redo things is that under the new structure, the agency can take in complaints, but they have to refer them back to the Internal Affairs Department for investigation. But then the executive director of the agency can review those internal affairs investigations and sort of make a finding as to whether or not they are complete, and then report on that activity to the board. And then the board can make findings around those things. And so that's kind of how that system is working. And again, if anybody's on the call that can talk more about that, we'd love to hear from you when we get to the discussion part. Wisconsin passed a statute that requires union representation on the fire and police commissions that exist in that state. So under the previous law, the fire and police commissions consisted of 7 or 9 members that were selected by the mayor. But now this new bill requires that at least 1 member has to be selected from a list of union representatives. And so that happened in Wisconsin. We'll see kind of how that plays out. And then also Florida. Florida also passed a statute that eliminated the existing civilian oversight entities and limited new ones that were created to follow. This legislation was signed by Governor DeSantis in April of last year, and it eliminated 21 oversight agencies that were functioning in Florida jurisdictions. And it did this by prohibiting the municipalities from enforcing any ordinances related to civilian oversight that was involved in receiving and investigating complaints. And so it's a pretty powerful thing. And of course, We know that, the folks in Miami at the Civilian Investigative Panel, which was very ably led for many years by Rodney, did their best to put up a fight. They filed a lawsuit seeking to prevent the city from defunding the agency. So in the wake of the statute, the city said, we're going to, you're taking away your funding. You can't exist. And so the agency tried to argue that, they actually could exist, that the new statute didn't require them to go away altogether. But unfortunately, the judge did not find in their favor and found that the city has a sovereign power to make budget decisions, right? And they can say, we're not going to fund this anymore. So even if the agency were to get beyond the legal constraints of the statute, they still have the issue of the city has the right to decide where it wants to put its money. And so that was kind of a tough call. That was a tough outcome. Moving on to the municipal law, right, which is, the local law, the ordinances, and the city charters. They obviously impact civilian oversight, because civilian oversight is typically created by city ordinances and city charters. And so we have the establishing ordinances or charters that impact civilian oversight in terms of powers and scope. We have civil service rules sometimes impact the work of civilian oversight. Collective bargaining agreements, we know, are often a constraint on how civilian oversight can operate. And then sometimes there's additional substantive law that exists in the cities that can affect the scope of civilian oversight. So let me just talk about some of the key pieces for a second. So we know that when the key piece of legislation at the local level around civilian oversight is the ordinance or charter that establishes the entity. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the key pieces of these ordinances and in terms of, what are some of the key provisions and what are some of the trends that we're seeing in these. So we know that, when there's, an ordinance that creates a civilian oversight board, then, the ordinance defines the scope of the board membership and the nature of the board membership. So that includes the size, the appointment criteria, as well as the appointment, like the disqualification. So the qualifications for appointment and the things then that can disqualify someone from being a member, such as, previously serving as a law enforcement officer within a certain time period. And so that's always going to be an important piece. There's also the issue of agency leadership, and how the agency leaders are appointed, what their qualifications are, what the method of appointment is. But what's become more interesting recently is um, who has the power to remove an agency head, and who has the power to impact the conduct of the agency head. And so there's been some controversy in Chicago that's actually pitted one oversight agency against the other, where we have a community commission, which is sort of an overall commission, that was given the power to make certain decisions around the head of the oversight, the administrative investigative agency. So, and that is COPA. And so that's caused me to sort of have a question about, wow, okay, you wonder, because, having leadership of an oversight agency that is independent and can make independent decisions, I think is absolutely critical. And so the question is, what happens when you have one agency that has this kind of influence over the other? And so just looking at that question a little bit, I took a look at some of the cities where you have the situation where you have a board that has oversight power over an agency head. And, when you look at those entities, just over a third of the cities, the board is involved in hiring the civilian oversight leader. For approximately half, though, the city manager or the mayor drives the hiring process. And in one of the cities I looked at, the city council oversees hiring. But looking at removal, there's some interesting things, right? In Albuquerque, the head of the agency can be removed for cause by a 2/3 vote of the city council. In Chicago, though, there's this idea that the community commission can do a vote of no confidence in the head of the investigative agency and then cause a vote to be taken by the city council that can end up in the removal of that person. In San Francisco, the director of their agency serves at the pleasure of their police commission. So again, we do see some situations where we have, you know, one agency that has this influence over the other. And I'd love to have a conversation with you all to understand what your thoughts are about the concerns around independence when we have those situations. And then just further looking at the outside influence on civilian oversight leadership. This is just a few of the agencies that I looked at, in their ordinance provisions around this. In Albuquerque, the contract compliance officer in that city reviews the office and the board, and then that person reports to the mayor and the city council. In Austin, the board has the power to assess the effectiveness of the agency and suggest improvements. In Boston, the executive director is by ordinance is supposed to be responsible for carrying out the policies and decisions of the commission, right? So again, this commission is really driving the work of this particular director. I mentioned the situation in Chicago. In Indianapolis, the director is subject to review and evaluation by the mayor or the mayor's designee with the advice and consent of the board. In Oakland, the board sets performance criteria and conducts reviews of the agency leader, and they can seek input from the public on the performance of the agency leader. In Philadelphia, the board sets performance criteria and also conducts reviews and can seek input from individuals who are familiar with the work of the agency head. In Phoenix, the city manager provides performance reviews for the agency head. In San Francisco, the police commission has the power and duty to organize the oversight agency, the Department of Police Accountability. And of course, in Seattle, the agency head reports directly to the police chief. So that's kind of where things stand in some of these agencies where we have this external influence on agency leadership, which, has the potential to create challenges for leaders, for sure. Onto duties and powers. So when you look at the duties and powers in an establishing ordinance, I sort of break it down into subject matter jurisdiction, what kinds of cases the agency can get involved with, personal jurisdiction, meaning the people over whom the agency has jurisdiction, the duties, what the ordinance says the agency must perform, and then the powers, meaning the other kinds of conduct and activities the agency has the power to do, but may do or not do in their discretion. Of course, subpoena power is often considered one of the most important sources of powers. And when we think about civilian oversight, responsibilities, it really falls into one of these four buckets, right? Involvement in policymaking, involvement in disciplinary matters, involvement in transparency around policing and police activity, and then community engagement around policing and police activity. So we're seeing all those reflected in ordinances when entities are being created these days. Ordinances also cover the operating procedures, so high-level procedural rules by which an agency has to operate, how recommendations are promulgated, for example, how procedures are done, time limitations for investigations and reviews. And so we're seeing a lot of details around some of these things, particularly time limitations. Budget appropriations. This is something that I wrote about last year, in that there are some agencies that have been established with floors on the budget or requirements for staffing. And what, through research, what I learned is that can be a double-edged sword, because a lot of times cities then use that floor as actually a ceiling. They don't give the agency any more than whatever that established floor is. And so those can be problematic, but they're also continuing to be fairly limited. There's still a very few agencies that are established with a budget floor. Duty to cooperate. Okay, this has become a really, really an important thing. So if you are working on revisiting the ordinance that, that is behind your agency, or if you are working on building a new agency in your um in your area, this is an important thing to pay attention to, because access to information is just really, really, really difficult. And this is something that, I learned when I was researching how well agencies are keeping up with their caseloads. And what I constantly heard was that many agencies are having a hard time getting information on a timely basis from the law enforcement agencies. And so this access to information has also engendered a fair amount of litigation, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is something that's really important to consider. So for example, in Albany, they have a citizen review board that filed a lawsuit that, over the lack of response to subpoenas by the law enforcement agencies. And even though this entity, this review board, was passed with a overwhelming voter referendum saying, look, people really wanted this, the police department was just really, really bad about being responsive to the subpoenas. And so they had to actually resort to litigation to try to enforce what was in, what they had the right to have access to. Similarly, in San Diego, we see similar issues with the sheriff's office, really not being really responsive to requests for information by the clerk, which exists in that city. So there's a lot of issues with that. And so this is something that we have to pay attention to. Reporting and transparency, again, this is something that's important to have, in the ordinance, that public reporting is going to be possible and allowed, certainly to the extent possible under the law in that state, because sometimes state law can limit, the kinds of information that's put out. But this is something that's come up a lot in terms of having, the power to be transparent about the work that's being done. Okay, so that's the statutory law piece. Now, moving on to recent litigation. Just looking at the number of cases over the recent time, they sort of peaked in 2022 with 13 cases. They've fallen down for a little bit in the last couple years, but there's still a lot of activity in terms of litigation going on. When we think about the subject matter of litigation in which civilian oversight entities have been engaged in these recent years, the top subject is really there's litigation around the scope of the authority of the civilian oversight entity. There's also litigation around the procedures that an agency follows. There's litigation around whether or not the agency can exist or not, right? And so that's also been a big source of litigation. Transparency issues, the impact of the agency's recommendations, the agency's decision-making has been the subject of litigation. Removal of people within the agency has been a subject, and then access to information has been the subject of cases. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the more interesting cases. Oh, here's just also, sorry for some more data on this, looking at the outcomes, whether the outcomes of these cases favorable versus unfavorable by topic. So we see when we're talking about access to information, there's only a couple of cases, so they're even. Decision making, more often than not, courts are coming out in favor of the civilian oversight entity. And with the scope of authority, it's, generally, civilian oversight entities are coming out ahead, but not always. There's issues around establishment where those cases have been really tough for civilian oversight agencies, as well as the cases where people are litigating, what the extent to which an entity can have, like, an entity's recommendation has to have, impact or, being binding, for example. Those have not gone well for civilian oversight entities. So just looking at outcomes for a minute, that's kind of by subject. Now let's get to some of the cases. So, right. So in 2022, there was a case in New York where there was an amendment to the city charter that created a police review board, and it was found to have it was in the city of Geneva, New York, and unfortunately, the court found that the creation of the board was in violation of a collective bargaining agreement, and so that's one where we lost the battle. The county of Sonoma engaged in litigation, and here the police union was unhappy with the enhanced powers given to the oversight agency as reflected in a ballot measure. So there was a ballot measure that said, we want to really enhance the powers of this oversight agency, and for the sheriff, and so the union challenged that, saying it was a violation of the collective bargaining agreement, that these measures that enhance the agency's powers were inconsistent with the officers' workplace, right? And so that was an issue, that was a challenge. And so that was an interesting case to look at. I'm trying to get through these quickly, so if we can get into more detail in the talk later if we need to. In Springfield, Massachusetts, there was a case in which a court upheld the city ordinance that reorganized the police department to be headed by a 5-member police board rather than a single police commissioner. This is an interesting case in that the city had historically had a police commission, and then there were budget issues, and so they got rid of the commission and they just created like a superintendent. But then the city said, no, we want more civilian oversight, and they created this police commission, and there was a fight over whether or not they could do that. And the court said no, that the city council had the power to actually do that. So that worked out. Then we have the case involving the Miami Civilian Investigative Panel that I mentioned. Where the court denied the agency's request for an injunction to prevent the city from defunding the agency in the wake of the state legislation. So we talked about that case. On scope of powers, there was a case in California where the court held that the Civilian Oversight Agency did have the authority to subpoena the sheriff regarding legitimate public interest stuff, and the sheriff had to testify under oath as required by the subpoena. So that was a big win. In Rochester, there was litigation which said that an amendment to the city charter authorizing a police accountability board to conduct disciplinary hearings exceeded the city's authority and conflicted with existing laws. So that was a tough one. A couple of good ones out of New York, though. In Lynch versus New York CCRB, the court upheld CCRB's rulemaking, which defined jurisdiction over complaints alleging abuse of authority to include allegations of sexual misconduct. And so in this way, the court was saying that the agency had the power to interpret their ordinance, which said that they have jurisdiction over abuse of authority. And they say, okay, we're going to define abuse of authority to include sexual misconduct. And the court said that was fine. Similarly, the agency made additional rulemaking that was challenged a couple of years later. And in this case, their rulemaking was to say, we're going to define abuse of authority to include non-compliance with body-worn camera usage policy. And the reason why they did that, and if anybody is on the call can talk about it later, that'd be great, is because they saw all these problems with body-worn camera policy violations that were just not being dealt with by the department at all. And so they felt like they needed to do something. And the court upheld that, and that was fine. Back to Sonoma County, there was additional, more recent litigation between that oversight agency and the sheriff around subpoenaing records. And so that was not a great outcome, in that the court found that the entity didn't have the authority to subpoena the sheriff for records while investigating whistleblower complaints that involve the staff. So it's a fairly specific, limited holding, but a negative one nonetheless. I mentioned the impact of recommendations. In this case, this was around in the city of Atlanta, around the Atlanta Civilian Review Board, and the court held that the failure to follow Civilian Review Board recommendations does not establish a policy of deliberate indifference, nor that the department's disciplinary investigations are deficient. So this was in the context of, findings around Monell claims. So we have that. And then decision making. This is also a case out of Los Angeles where the court held that an unintentionally recorded digital in-car video can be used as evidence of misconduct if it contains evidence of criminal or egregious misconduct. And so we have that case. Okay, so that is the sort of the subject matter. Just, in terms of key takeaways for me, and then, love to hear your questions as we get to them. Law enforcement agencies and unions, we all know, are generally resistant to oversight, and in particular will push back against enhanced oversight with litigation, and particularly where, we're building on top of, a system that existed already, and changing and enhancing an entity's powers. And so it's really important to be prepared for that litigation, and, in whatever way you need to do it, having, counsel ready, having the power to get counsel to help litigate these issues, and then budgeting for this kind of legal support. So because you're going to get the challenge once these things happen, and it almost doesn't matter, that's one of the key findings. It doesn't matter if there's been a voter referendum that says, look, the citizens really want the civilian oversight agency to have this additional power. It almost doesn't matter. There's still going to be challenges about it. And so we need to be mindful of that and prepare for that. The duty to cooperate and having a legal duty for the law enforcement agency to provide access to information is absolutely essential to the functioning of civilian oversight. And it's really important to make sure that makes its way into the establishing ordinance. A lot of agencies are using memorandum of understanding for this purpose. And there's a great one, I think. I'm pretty sure if you look at the one that's in Phoenix, it's very robust. And so that can work for sure, but it's better if you have it established in law and you don't have to negotiate for it, right? And so when we're creating entities, when we're reforming entities, this is something that's really important to build in. With regard to the state legislation, this is something that I know, NACOLE has had a few sessions around, and I'm not sure if we've cracked the nut in terms of how to really come together to push back on this kind of political onslaught, really, against civilian oversight. I wonder if there's a way for entities to come together, at least at the state level, to help to work together to educate state legislatures and garner support for civilian oversight to help counteract the aggressive political activity and lobbying that's done by law enforcement entities and unions to push back against civilian oversight. So I'm not sure what the right structure is for us to sort of to create this process, but I think we need to do something clearly to help, to stem the tide here, so that we can prevent these statutes from coming online to the extent possible. And then the last comment is, some oversight agencies have restructured to address these state law changes. And I'm, for one, would love to learn more about how they're able to operate in this new sort of landscape, and how well they feel like they're able to fulfill their mission within these constraints. Because maybe we can all learn from each other about these things. So that's something I'd love to hear more about if we have a chance to when we get to the discussion. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. We have one question right now. And I'm going to read it for the sake of those who are going to be watching this, the recording of this, who aren't able to attend today. So bear with me. The question is, who legally represents the oversight entities involved with litigation? City attorneys, and stops there.
Yeah. Well, it depends. So there are some entities that have the power to bring in outside counsel, uh, and and then they can do it on their own. In some cases, the cities are providing city attorneys, and the city attorney supports the civilian oversight entity and wants, the civilian entity to push back against, whatever the issue is, or to further the civilian oversight entity's goals. And so the city attorneys are doing the litigation. So it really depends on the issue and where you are.
Okay. Question number two. Hi, Sharon. As alluded to, Chicago is now searching for a new oversight chief. What do you perceive are the most important attributes the new chief embody? Also, given your experience, what changes or improvements would you hope to see at COPA?
Oh, I don't know if we have enough time for all that, but I'll give you the headlines, right? Um, you know, for the COPA chief, the qualifications are for any chief position, leadership position in civilian oversight. You need someone who is, is intelligent, has the requisite experience conducting, these kinds of investigations, has great interpersonal skills because there's so many different stakeholders that are involved in the process, understands the need for and community engagement around the policing issues, has good leadership, because, I think, one of the things that I learned from my experience is leading these kinds of agencies is an extraordinarily difficult job, because whatever decisions you're making, someone is always mad at you, right? You're making somebody mad all the time. So you need to have someone who has the emotional intelligence to just put the blinders on and tune all of that out, and can call the balls and strikes as they see them. And that takes a very specific kind of person who can just let all that roll off their back. And then it's also an extremely complex internal organization. And one of the things that, when we created COPA, we designed COPA to reflect a diverse range of opinions. Like, we didn't say, like, you can't be an investigator for COPA if you have law enforcement experience. We didn't think that was appropriate. People who have law enforcement experience have directly relevant experience, right? And so because of that, you have a wide range of views within the agency, and there were processes put in place to manage all those views. And so that's really is so you need someone who, as a leader, can deal with the diversity that exists, the diversity of viewpoints that exists within the agency, and that's not always easy. Now, what changes would I like to see at COPA? To be honest with you, I think that the entire system, we need to take a step back in Chicago and say, okay, we have this system that's been patched together over time. Is this the right thing, right? Is this working the way it should? And if not, maybe we should sort of rethink things and come up with a blank slate. What is it? What is it that we need now? And what have we learned from the last, 10 years since the Laquan McDonald incident sparked all the changes that happened in Chicago? So.
Another question. Although we have faced setbacks in Rochester, New York, including lawsuits and resistance from law enforcement, particularly the police union, we remain encouraged by recent developments. In fact, the Law Enforcement Misconduct Investigative Office mentioned our work in the 2024 annual report, highlighting the need to remove legal barriers to effective civilian oversight. Given the ongoing challenges many oversight agencies face, what strategies do you recommend for leveraging support from state-level agencies like LEMIO to strengthen local oversight authority and maintain momentum for reform?
Yeah. So first of all, congratulations and thank you for the work that you do. I mean, I know everybody on this call is out there doing fantastic work. And I know it's not easy. So thank you for that. Like I said, I think it's a really important, I think it's important for every entity to have a legislative agenda, meaning to have an understanding of what's going on in the legislative world that could impact what they do, and have a vision for how they want to deal with it, and what they want to have happen, right? And so if, for example, there are things on the legislative front that they want to accomplish, changes to their ordinance or changes to state law that they think would be helpful for themselves or for policing in general, then they should have a legislative agenda and a strategy for pursuing that, which I think involves educating legislators and having relationships with legislators on these topics, that you don't just engage when there's a crisis. Like if you have an ongoing dialogue with legislators on these topics, then chances are your interactions with them when you need something to happen will be more effective, because you don't have to spend as much time sort of educating them, right, on the topics. But if you're out there doing that all the time, then I think that could be helpful. Now, I know you guys are doing a lot of things, and this is just like one more thing to add to your plates. And so I don't mean to pour more on you, but I think that's kind of how I would see, dealing with these things.
Okay. Next question. Another query regarding Chicago. Does the litigation you described, that officers will be able to take disciplinary cases to arbitration, mean that the Chicago Police Board will cease to exist?
So no. So first of all, I want to be clear. What the legal situation is right now is that, there's been an arbitration ruling that the officers shall have the right to decide whether they want to pursue their case in arbitration or the police board. And so the police board will continue to exist for that purpose, but the police board has some other responsibilities that it will continue to exist for. So for example, when there's a disagreement between the COPA chief and the superintendent on the outcome of a case, the police board has some responsibility to resolve those disagreements. And so there are other things that the police board can do. Now, obviously, it's highly likely that the scope of their jurisdiction is going to be retracted greatly, right? Because we fully anticipate that, officers are most likely to choose to go to arbitration, because we know what happens in arbitration, right? So it's certainly going to be scaled back, but it won't go away.
Okay. And I think we can get to the last two. Related to
Okay.
the first question, the one about the attorneys, are you aware of any successful attempts to show that the use of a city or county attorney as the legal counsel for an oversight agency creates a conflict of interest? For example, a prosecutor's office that also represents the sheriff's office, or a city attorney that also represents the police department.
So am I aware of any legal uh, legal finding on that topic? I'm not. I think it's always been just conceptually an argument to be made that where you have a city attorney that on one hand represents the department and officers against allegations that the officer did something wrong, right? Trying to represent an agency that's now saying the officer actually did do something wrong, right? There's just conceptually, there's a conflict of interest in that. And, even though, like, for example, in Chicago, they would say, oh, well, there's a firewall, like those two sides report up. There's a firewall between those two sides. But the problem is those sides report up to one city attorney, right? One person who's making decisions around how much money goes to this side, right? How much money goes to this side. And so it's conceptually, it's a conflict of interest. But I'm not aware of any case law that actually says that. I haven't researched that question, so I don't. There could be. I'm just saying I haven't come across any.
And this question, if you choose not to answer, perfectly fine. Would you be open to consulting CCPSA and COPA on transforming oversight in Chicago?
You know what? You guys know me. I'm passionate about civilian oversight. I'm here to serve. I'm happy to help in any way that I can, right? Within the constraints of I do have a full-time job teaching. And so, that's why I try to stay involved in these things. I did, for example, contribute to an amicus brief in the litigation over arbitration. So I do try to stay involved where I have the time to do so.
Okay. That was the final question. And so for those of us, or for anybody who would like to join the post-webinar discussion where you can actually see each other, Professor Fairley will be able to see those of you with questions and you can talk directly to each other instead of going through me or typing it in the chat. Please feel free to join us. Even if you don't have a particular question but might want to share something or just hear the continued conversation. I will make a couple of announcements. A webinar email will be sent out within 5 business days of today, which will include a link to the recording as well as a PDF, a link to the PDF version of the slides that Professor Fairley shared with us today. We will not have a webinar in May. The next one is scheduled for June and will focus on AI and oversight. We actually have our first regional meeting since COVID or before COVID, which will take place May the 13th in New York in Brooklyn. And so if you would like to, it's a one-day event. If you're nearby and want to attend, the registration and information is on the website. And if you don't know already, our annual conference is taking place in Minneapolis this year in October. And so the dates are on the website, but we will have registration up within the next month or so. So stay tuned for all those upcoming events. And so thank you so much for your time today
My
and
pleasure.
your expertise and your willingness to engage with everyone regarding this world of oversight. I'm going to wait for everyone who wants to join the post-webinar discussion to grab that link. If you click it from here, you will be kicked out of this webinar. Just hold on, you'll be put in the waiting room for the discussion. And so I just want to make sure I'm on here and everyone who wants to attend grabs that link before I end this. So if you're ready to go to the Zoom discussion, feel free to click that link and I will
Thanks,
see.
everyone. I'll see you in the link if you're joining. If not, rock on. Great job. Thank you for all that you do.
Okay. All right. See you there.